Jason Evans is a professor of environmental science and studies at Stetson University, and he is also the executive director of the Institute for Water and Environmental Resilience. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Absolutely. Thanks.
So I'd like to start just by asking you about kind of a systems perspective. How is the interface between human and natural systems changing right now?
So, it's a really great question. And so this really goes back to, I'd say, like the Industrial Revolution. So humans and fossil fuels and use of fossil fuels, we've accelerated of all kinds of processes within the Earth system. And so we have the carbon cycle that we think about with climate change, but we have the nitrogen cycle that we have accelerated with things like the Haber-Bosch process and nitrogen fertilizers, and any kind of material we can think about, phosphorus. And so if we think of our cities and we think of, the way that we live, we think of our food systems, we are really the dominant geologic factor right now. And I teach my students, if you can imagine having like a geologist from, say, like a million years in the future, that they will see this time, right? Like this time that we're in right now. The Anthropocene is what, of course, some people want to call it, and I'm in that camp. And so we're just changing every single aspect of the entire Earth system, and so we're kind of engineering the Earth in very unpredictable ways. And so it's scary and it's exciting. We live through exciting times.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the way we think about those systems and the way we change those systems both intentionally and unintentionally, and specifically for coastal communities and cities. I know a lot of your work has to do with specifically the communities and cities along coastlines. Can you talk about the specific dynamics along coastlines right now associated with human and natural systems and how they're changing?
Sure. And so within coastlines, especially within areas like the southeastern United States, which is that's where I live, of course, Florida is where I live, that within these low-lying coastal environments, one of the early indicators of climate change, of course, is sea level rise. And so we're seeing those impacts. And I always tell every coastal community that I work with, and that they are having impacts with sea level rise, whether they know it or not. And actually, most of them do know it. And so we're seeing these impacts with just rising waters, but we're also seeing it's not just the sea level rise. We're also seeing these more intensive rainfall events, and so we're getting these, extreme bursts of rainfall. So again, like here in Central Florida, where I live, afternoon thunderstorms seem like they're becoming more intensive, and so you get more rainfall intensity. A lot of water dropping really fast, and we get, of course, these flooding events. And then with hurricanes, it's now pretty conclusive that we're seeing hurricanes getting larger and they're getting wetter. And so these big hurricanes that we've seen over the past few years, and they're being fueled by, of course, the warmer oceans. And so that's a very direct impact of climate change, and this is really impacting, of course, coastal communities. And so that's a big, big stressor. And so every local government that is within these coastal areas, and then in particular, coastal communities that were built 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago, St. Augustine, 400 years ago, they have infrastructure that's old, that all that infrastructure is being impacted by, of course, climate change. And so what do we do with that? So that's really the big challenge that we have with coastal communities.
Yeah, and the infrastructure part is really interesting to me. One of the things I saw in reading up on your research was that there are vulnerability assessments
Yeah.
that are done. Can you talk about what vulnerability assessments look at and how local communities and cities take that information and use it?
Sure. And so when I think of a vulnerability assessment, and VAs we call them just for short, so I might just use that acronym here. So when we're doing a vulnerability assessment, the first thing is just to figure out what assets a community has. You go out and it's like an inventory, so what are the critical assets? And so these are things like wastewater treatment plants. These are your major roads, your major uh, services, so say fire stations, police stations, medical, um, and so then just understanding where those things are, right? And just getting a map of all of those things and inventorying them. And then just seeing where they are, and then just how vulnerable are they to various kinds of hazards, and in particular with flooding, that we're looking at flooding. And so then running like different event scenarios. And so if you were to get a category 5 hurricane and you're to get a storm surge associated with that, what would be the impact to your fire stations? What would be the impact to your police stations? And then not just now, but thinking in the future. So if we put sea level rise on top of that, and so you might have a fire station that's going to be safe now, but you have, say, 1 foot of sea level rise, which is possible in the next 25, 30 years, that's going to be vulnerable to the same kind of storm surge. And so going through and for each class of assets, understanding just what are the vulnerabilities, what are the failure points for some of this infrastructure. And so, for example, stormwater infrastructure, which we use to drain things, like all these pipes that are underground, that tends to be the most vulnerable infrastructure within coastal communities to sea level rise. Because if you think about it, it's very intuitive. That stuff's in the ground. It goes out oftentimes right into estuaries, right into the saltwater ecosystems. And a lot of it's pretty old. It wasn't built, when it was built 50, 60, 70 years ago, the engineers were not thinking, how do we make this resilient to sea level rise? They built it and they were thinking that, the sea is going to be the same level forever. Um, and so, yeah, going through, and then so first finding out what is vulnerable and when, and then for what hazard, and then for two, then the harder part even is think about, okay, now what do we do about that?
Hmm.
Right? What are the priorities? Where are you get funding for this? What are the things that we need to really fix now? And then even, the really hard conversations are what is too expensive to fix? And, we might even need to think about, yeah, de-investing from certain places. Are there actually certain places that you can build, you can build all kinds of infrastructure, but it's just going to be really expensive and it's not going to work, or there's going to, and so those are really hard conversations with vulnerability assessments.
So for those hard conversations, are those usually like the closer you get to water, that the infrastructure just becomes so difficult to maintain because they're being um, either inundated or the risk of a hurricane um, destroying that infrastructure is so high that it doesn't make sense to allocate the amount of money necessary. Uh, is that the kind of dynamic, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, that's it's a really good question. So there's really a lot of factors. A lot of it just really has to do with elevation.
Mm.
So it's lower, and if you have um, and also at the criticality, I guess, of the infrastructure as well, and then what you're trying to protect. And so they always use the analogy of like garden sheds, right? So you might find that there's a vulnerable garden shed, but you're not going to spend very much to try to protect the garden shed. Maybe it's just easier to move it. But then if you think of something like a nuclear power plant, right, then you're
Mm.
going to spend a lot of money. And for one, you want to site it correctly. You don't want to put it in a spot that's vulnerable. But if it is vulnerable, then it can make a lot of sense to do whatever you need because the risk, right? So that if like something bad was to happen, then it's a catastrophic impact. And so and so yeah, then how close you are to water, that's certainly a factor, but it's even you can be right next to the water, but if it happens to be on a bluff, it might not be that vulnerable. But then
Hmm.
if you're inland a bit, and then I've seen areas where it's inland, but it was built on like filled wetlands, and then it's been sinking over time, and then it's just incredibly just flood prone to rainfall, and then to try to build something to try to protect it, just would be astronomically expensive. And so it's very site specific, but yeah, so it's really getting in the weeds of understanding what that is. And then typically the local governments already know, because uh, of the spots that are the most vulnerable, we already have problems there, right? So there's flooding that happens, and oftentimes what will prompt the local government to do a vulnerability assessment is they'll have some kind of big impact, and then they'll see there's flooding, and they're like, oh wow, and then we need to, we don't want that to happen again. So what can we do to try to prevent that?
Yeah. So you said earlier that a lot of times the local governments know, um, like that sea level rise is happening, and they're going to have these impacts. Are they able to address these in a timely manner, or are these part of long-term plans, or how quickly are cities adapting to sea level rise, and what does that look like?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And so it's really variable. And then so we see like certain places that are having impacts. And I think Miami Beach, right? So Miami Beach is incredibly vulnerable, and they've been investing a huge amount of money. And so they've been experimenting, and you know uh having some wins, having some things that didn't turn out the way they had hoped, probably. And so we're seeing a lot of that experimentation. But we have other local governments that may know there's an issue, but they don't have resources, and so the adaptation there is obviously really, really slow. And so that's kind of a wait and see approach, as we call it. Sometimes that can just be default. And so I would say. I will say that here in Florida, that the state has invested a large amount of money to actually help local governments do these vulnerability assessments over the past several years, through something that's called the Resilient Florida Program. The state has invested a huge amount of money, and so then through actually doing those vulnerability assessments, it's really helped a lot of the local governments that didn't have the resources. They wouldn't have done it on their own, but the state actually mandated. They said, coastal governments, you have to do it, but we're going to give you funding assistance to do it. And then, just kind of full disclosure, I've worked under that program, and I've had funding through that program. But that's been a really good program, to where now, at least in Florida, I can say that we've got a pretty good handle. Right, there's always more work to do, but vulnerability assessments for most communities have been completed. But then now the state is saying, okay, we want projects, and then there's a lot of money that's going into that. And for me, the trick is going to be is how to really prioritize, because we can throw a lot of money at things, and then it's like anything, right? Some of the money might be well spent, and some of it might not. It could be well intentioned, and so the how we can, yeah, how that's going to play out. It's going to be one of the most interesting things to watch over the next 10, 15 years. Is that how is that adaptation going to play out?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm curious about is as storms are strengthening and getting wetter, as you described, the 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 new things that get built are also still at risk. So
Yes.
if there's an investment made at the state level, is there a understanding that that investment will have to continue to be made every time there's a storm of a certain size, or is there some sort of rhythm to the adaptation funding and programs?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And so I think, at least I hope, within the policy sense, that of course, like, resilience is not that you're there. That's one of the things, again, I teach. That it's like, okay, we do a vulnerability assessment, we do projects, we're done. I'm like, no, no, no. Resilience is you're constantly adapting, and then there's going to be new storms, there's going to be impacts that we don't expect. Um, and of course, it's hard to plan for hurricanes, right? And so like the big storms, they're kind of not exactly random events, but we don't know, right? We don't know when is someone going to get hit by a Category 5 hurricane. Um, and so, at least at the state level, there's been a lot of what I will also say is that the states and it's not just Florida, but all the states have been reliant upon the federal government, right? So when you have a big disaster, then there's a lot of money that comes into the federal government. Right now, of course, that's in churn, right? As to whether or not we're going to have this federal disaster infrastructure that we've had. There's a whole lot of discussion about ending. I think like even ending FEMA. I think is and so. And so we'll see where that goes. If that happens, that I think all the plans that states and local governments have right now, they basically assume that we have FEMA, that there's this federal backstop. If that goes away, then it's a whole new conversation, right? That local governments and states have to figure out, what do we do? We have to have this kind of backstop, right? And so that's really uncertain right now because again of all this like federal churn.
Yeah. So in a typical hurricane, is it the case that at least at the local level, the local government is immediately overwhelmed because of the amount of destruction of the hurricane? Or is it even possible for a local government to be resilient without state support?
Yeah, and so of course that's going to be really dependent on really on the size of the local government, and then of course the size of the storm. And so the way it's worked in like say in like federal disaster declarations is there's even like, okay, so there's a storm that comes and then we're going to say that there's gonna be damage. Um, and then the feds oftentimes will decide, can the local government or the state government, do they have enough resources to deal with it? And if they say, then okay, you do, then the feds are not going, they're not going to say that it's a federal disaster, so to say. And so, but for most of the big hurricanes that we've had here in Florida over the past number of years, that at least in certain areas that it's been declared a disaster, the federal government comes in. And so if that goes away, I mean, it's that that's a really, really tough question, right? So for a state like Florida, we even have like state insurance, right? For homeowners insurance. It's so expensive to get insurance in Florida that we have like a federal or a state a backstop for homeowners insurance. And if we had, my nightmare is you get a really big hurricane that hits somewhere like Tampa Bay, and then what's that going to mean for the state's coffers?
Hmm.
And so yeah, with all of that, again, it's really when it comes to climate adaptation, a lot of us even kind of talk about that. What actually drives a lot of what is being done in the states um, is actually because of insurance, right?
Hmm.
That insurance companies definitely believe in climate change. That's what I always tell my conservative friends and people that might not think that climate change is real. They're kind of doubtful. I was like, one industry that believes in it is going to be insurance because they have to price risk, and so of
Right.
course they're going to price risk and they're going to look at the best available data, and it turns out climate change science is definitely part of what they use when they're making their risk models.
So are local governments able to tap into insurance for public infrastructure?
That's a really good question. And so I think at least some things, yes. I'm not truly an expert in this field. I know that a lot of local governments are self-insured when it comes to their own infrastructure, but I'm sure that some infrastructure is actually insured.
Hmm. Well, I want to switch gears just a little bit. I wanted to also ask you about how we're talking about human and natural systems but the interface and how those systems are changing. How are habitats impacted by all of the changes that are going on along coastlines?
Sure. And so what we're seeing within a lot of areas is we're seeing the saltwater ecosystems just move inland. And
Hmm.
so some of the areas that this is really, really obvious would be areas of coastal North Carolina. We see these ghost forests that they're called, where you'll see like all these like dead pine trees, and what's underneath it is actually salt marsh, and
Hmm.
it's because the sea is rising up, and then it's killing off the pine trees, and then you're getting the salt marsh, is moving in, and um, and so we're certainly seeing those impacts. And here in Florida, one of the interesting things that we're seeing is mangroves, which are this big woody shrub that grows along the coastal areas. And they're very, very, uh, oh, they can't take cold. They're very, very freeze intolerant. But they're moving northward. And so we're seeing mangroves even going into areas of coastal Georgia now, which was completely unheard of. And it's just because the winters are not getting as cold. We're not getting these extended freezes, and that's allowing for the mangroves to just march up towards the north. And this we're seeing all around the world. It's a global phenomenon that mangroves are moving towards the poles. Um,
Huh.
and that's certainly changing ecosystems, and so um, and the other big thing that we see in terms of the warming of the oceans, that the warming also tends to make algal blooms worse. And
Hmm.
so when we think of algal blooms, that we typically think of nutrients, so it'd be phosphorus and nitrogen, but they're also temperature is also a really big driver of these algal blooms. And so we get these warmer temperatures over the summer, along with things like runoff and nutrients that we put into the waterways, that seems to be driving the algal bloom formation as well.
So, with regard to that, and you mentioned runoff, is there um, kind of a trend for local governments to collaborate more regionally to address some of these issues where you have something up a river, so to speak, or further up the coastline, or just in a different place, affecting somewhere that's not in the same jurisdiction?
Sure, yeah. So we have some really good examples of this. So, for example, like Chesapeake Bay, there have been these like regional um, compacts to try to actually address runoff, and then trying to address things like algal blooms and then loading of nitrogen. Um, and then so fisheries are really important, of course, within coastal communities. And when we start seeing algal blooms and then dead zones that really start to impact fisheries, then that's is oftentimes these crises that'll drive the cooperation. And even more locally here in Florida, again, the Indian River Lagoon it's this area that's along the east coast of Florida. It's 156 miles long, and just has been impacted by really devastating algal blooms over the past 15 years or so. It's incredibly biodiverse estuary, and there's all kinds of cooperation is happening amongst the local governments in that area to try to clean up the lagoon. Um, and so when you see kind of dead fish and like huge fish kills that have happened, Brevard County is an area that I work a lot. They had some really devastating fish kills there, in particular, about like 6, 7, 8 years ago. And then that drove the local government, which is a pretty conservative local government that's, um, not I'd say generally for higher taxes, but they actually tax themselves. They actually passed a sales tax to clean up the lagoon. And so
Wow.
it's in a sense a sales tax that is funding all kinds of projects, and we're seeing good impact from that. So we're actually seeing the lagoon slowly recover through this, very, very sustained investment. And so That just shows that, with investment and with stewardship, especially with water quality, we can certainly make a difference.
So, with regards to that, kind of arguing the case for funding something like that, how is that done? I think there have been a couple of moments as you've been talking where you've either spoken directly or alluded to like the business of a place or the industry of a place, and
Mhm.
and also just the notion of insurance, thinking about like home assets. And I wonder, do you have examples of businesses engaging in the conversation where, either the tourism of an area or the
Sure.
fishing industry or anything like that sees the value in investing in the environment?
Sure. And so, as again, here in Florida, we have a long history of kind of captains, right? Captains for Clean Water. That's an organization that's here in Florida that, boat captains that they make their living by taking people out to go fishing, and yeah, to really enjoy the clean water, to enjoy that bounty. And so when you have things like massive red tides, or you have massive algal blooms and fish kills, that's clearly not good for them. And so they've been very effective at organizing, and it's one of the few things. And clean water is one of the things, at least in Florida where I live, that that it tends to be bipartisan, and
Hmm.
that there's that um, yeah, there might be kind of disagreement as to what to do, but in terms of clean water as being something that people can rally around. Um, and so, um, yeah, I'd say that's been really important. Been the captains, and they're kind of obvious, but then others as well. Seem like even like the real estate industry, which oftentimes you might think, real estate. Again, in Florida, it's all about building everything, and new houses and new development, which can be, uh, if it's done the wrong way, that can be antithetical to clean water. But again, when you have fish kills, and you have that tends to not be good for your home value, to have dead fish and smelling, or algal blooms, and having health hazards because of algal blooms. So yeah, there's even been kind of real estate industry has also been interested in trying to help come up with solutions, and and even some of the landscaping industry. There have been some great examples of. So when it comes to clean water in particular, so just one of my pet peeves is grass, right? So grass that people have in their yards, right? Right. Your like suburban lawn is one of the like biggest enemies that there is for clean water, and then for climate and a whole bunch of other things. But it's and so the landscaping industry, that there's at least a few folks here in Florida that are, they're like big landscaping companies, are actually promoting native plants and kind of low water impact, and then kind of climate friendly, and then they can make money off of just selling those plants versus grass, and then you still have to maintain it. You still want it to look nice, and so that's been a really interesting thing to watch, as within the landscaping industry, this kind of alternative way of looking at it. And so that's been another maybe unlikely advocate for the kind of things that yeah, that I'd like to promote.
Yeah. Well, the runoff issue seems like a really tough challenge to me. Do you are there any examples of the local government in or local governments along coastlines, um, either passing laws to stop certain use of chemicals on whether it's lawns or farms, or is it more common to see kind of reactive investments in cleanup?
That is a really good question. So there have been examples in Florida of actually fertilizer ordinances, and actually where I live in Volusia County, Florida, we actually have a fertilizer ordinance where you're not supposed to fertilize your lawns between I forget the exact dates because I don't actually fertilize my lawn ever, but so it's but there's a certain time that you're not supposed to fertilize. How well it's enforced is another question, but and then I think the Florida legislature has actually tried to preempt local governments from doing that anymore.
Mm,
But there are examples of that. But then actually to your point that yeah, certainly there's been a lot. It's a lot more expensive on the other end, and
mm,
then there is a lot of okay, we get to a crisis point, we need to spend a lot of money to try to fix something. Um, and then, yeah, then being an ecologist, it's much harder to put something back together than it is not to break it in the first place. And so if you break an ecosystem and then you try to put it back and you do restoration, and I like doing restoration ecology, but yeah, for one, you're probably never going to get it back to what it was. I mean, you can make it better, you can improve it. But to get it there, it can be really, really expensive. And so it is, I think, less expensive to not break it in the first place. But that's a hard sell. I mean, or oftentimes we don't know we're going to break it until we break it. Um,
mm.
but this even gets into just the way the Clean Water Act was originally set up. I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but it basically that like investment goes once something becomes impaired, and that's when there's a lot of resources that go into something. But if it's not impaired, then you can kind of pollute it until it gets impaired. I mean, like as long as you have permits to do it, and so it's so yeah, so it would be nice to not actually break things before yeah, just to take action before it gets to that point.
Yeah, and that kind of uh, wisdom that the cost is going to be higher once you break it, I think is really that resonated with me a lot, and I wonder if policymakers are picking up on that wisdom more and more, or if it's still like um, out of sight, out of mind, or something.
I've got so I have an anecdote to share on that, right? So policymakers and yeah, and policymakers are all over the map, and like dealing with legislators and all that kind of thing. But I'll share. I'm not going to say who it was, but here in Volusia County, we had some really severe fires about 27, 28 years ago, like really severe fires that came in and were incredibly destructive. And then after the fires, that there's been a pretty aggressive program over the past 25 years of doing controlled burns, within public lands, and so the states help fund that, but even the local government. But then just recently, that when kind of looking for things to cut, they're like, we got this burn program here, and we haven't had any fires in a while. Why do we need that anymore? And it's just like, yeah, that's the whole point. Is you
Right.
don't
Yeah.
want fires, you don't, and so you need to have you don't want it to get to the crisis point. You want to manage this, spend a little bit of money, right? And yeah, and then if it works, then you're not going to have the problem that you're trying to spend to protect. But that can oftentimes be an easy, like we don't have that problem anymore. We fixed that, and it's like, well, if you stop doing this, you're going to have that problem again. And so how to get how to get that out there, because I think it's easy, that I like to give policymakers the benefit of the doubt because hopefully it's just lack of education. Like they just don't understand that like someone needs to educate you about this relationship. And so that's me being optimistic, right? Is that we can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if it's also the time horizon is so long that people forget because they hadn't seen the first event
Yes.
or the inciting event that caused the policy, or um so just yeah, I feel like it's an educational exercise to just constantly educate not just policymakers but the general public of um I mean a lot of environmental and sustainability issues. So
That's
um, I mean that's part of why I wanted to have a conversation with you. So I appreciate you um, kind of telling that anecdote and kind of underlining that need. Um, I want to ask you one more question about the future and thinking about how this work might look in 3 years or 10 years or even further out, and what you see as kind of an optimistic uh, outlook for climate adaptation work and sustainability generally.
Sure. So one thing I can really say is that when it comes to flood mapping and the kind of work that I do, that the models are getting so good, and that we've gone from, even like 10, 15 years ago, that we had okay flood maps and we kind of understood the risk. Now we really understand the risk. And so when there's a big event that happens, like Hurricane Ian that happened here, and then where the flooding happened, you like you put that event into our flood models, and it shows exactly where it flooded, very, very close. And so we have really good information. And so I think that that 5, 10 years from now, that we're going to make it through this, kind of this like disruption that we're having. I'm just going to call it kind of at the federal level. And so we're really disrupting the way that we govern ourselves. And then
Mhm.
there's going to be this reorganization of, things, I think, becoming more local, and then the optimistic side of that is that, having kind of that federal backstop in some ways, it could allow for kind of for local governments to make bad decisions, because then when it came time to pay, then the federal government's going to come in. And so I'm trying to be very optimistic here, but I think that yeah, I think local governments are going to have to get their houses in order, and then understand, okay, that you're going to be the ones that are going to be on the hook for whatever decisions and whatever bad decisions were made in the past, or in particular whatever you make in the future. And then I think that's going to help kind of rationalize decision making,
Mm.
at least at the local level. And then I'm really hopeful, because again, people ask me, like, what do we do to prevent, how do we reduce our risk from sea level rise? And like, you show them these really devastating models, like 5, 6 feet of sea level rise. And someone asked me, like, what do we do about that? I'm like, you got to stop with all the carbon emission, and then we've got to get it globally under control, because like, how do you adapt to that? I'm like, you don't. And so the way you adapt to that is you actually prevent it. Is that we adapt by saying this is not an acceptable future. And if we have that, then okay, then we have to get our house in order, of course, on the carbon side. And so like, trying to kind of decouple these things, which I've seen people try to do, like, let's just talk about flooding. I'm like, well, if you're talking about 6 feet of sea level rise, you're talking about climate change. You're not just
Mm.
talking about flooding risk. And so it's actually coupling those things back together. Um, and so I want to be optimistic. I have to be optimistic. Is that there's going to be this global realization. I think there is, that, even though we don't, sometimes we don't want to admit, okay, climate change is real. It's real, and we have to deal with it, or it's going to deal with us.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing insight and wisdom, and I hope we can continue the conversation down the road. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.